Asemoglu, Why Nations Fail. 8. Barriers to Development.
Did you know that in 1445, Johannes Gutenberg unveiled an innovation in the German city of Mainz, a printing press based on movable type, which had profound consequences for subsequent economic history? Previously, books were either hand-copied by scribes, a very laborious process, or block-printed with specific wood pieces cut for each page, making books few and expensive.
Indeed, after Gutenberg's invention, books were printed and became more readily available, making mass literacy and education possible. The technology spread quickly in Western Europe. By the late 1460s, presses were throughout Italy, including Rome and Venice, and by 1476, William Caxton had set up a press in London.
But not everyone welcomed this innovation. As early as 1485, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II issued an edict expressly forbidding Muslims from printing in Arabic, a rule later reinforced by Sultan Selim I in 1515.
That prohibition lasted a long time. It wasn't until 1727 that the first printing press was allowed in the Ottoman lands, when Sultan Ahmed III issued a decree granting Ibrahim Mutefferika permission.
Even that belated step was hedged with restraints. Mutefferika's printing was closely monitored. The decree specified that the printed books had to be free from mistakes, and a panel of wise, respected religious and legal scholars, the Qadis of Istanbul, Saloniki, and Galata, would oversee the proofreading.
Mutefferika printed few books in the end, only 17 between 1729 and 1743. The consequences of this opposition for literacy and economic success were significant.
Yes, by 1800, probably only 2 to 3% of the citizens of the Ottoman Empire were literate, compared with 60% of adult males and 40% of adult females in England.
Given the highly absolutist and extractive Ottoman institutions, the hostility is easy to understand. Books spread ideas and make the population much harder to control. This threatened the existing status quo where knowledge was controlled by elites. The Ottoman sultans and the religious establishment feared the creative destruction that would result, and their solution was to forbid printing.
The Industrial Revolution created a critical juncture. England encouraged commerce, industrialization, and entrepreneurship, leading to rapid growth. But many absolutist regimes like the Ottoman Empire in China lagged behind because they blocked or did nothing to encourage the spread of industry.
The Ottoman Empire remained absolutist until its collapse at the end of the First World War, successfully impeding innovations like the printing press. The reason economic changes did not happen there is the natural connection between extractive, absolutist political institutions and extractive economic institutions.
Absolutism is defined as rule unconstrained by law or the wishes of others, though in reality, absolutists rule with the support of some small group or elite. Russia under the Tsars provides an example where rulers were supported by a nobility representing about 1% of the total population.
And Russia's economic institutions were highly extractive, organized to make the Tsar and nobility wealthy, based on labor coercion like serfdom.
However, absolutism was not the only type of institution preventing industrialization. Even today, countries like Afghanistan, Haiti, and Nepal lack political centralization. Without a centralized state to provide order and enforce rules and property rights, inclusive institutions cannot emerge.
Absolutism and a lack of political centralization are two different barriers, but they are connected, both being sustained by the fear of creative destruction.
We see how political centralization can lead to absolutism, as with Peter the Great in Russia, who forged Russian absolutism between 1682 and 1725. He built St. Petersburg, stripped power from the boyars, created a modern bureaucratic state, and even took control over the church.
Peter was taking power away from others and redirecting it toward himself. In contrast, in England, the process of political centralization under the Tudor monarchy increased demands for voice and representation by local elites, ultimately enabling the emergence of inclusive political institutions.
So during the critical juncture of the Industrial Revolution, many nations missed the boat either because they had absolutist political and extractive economic institutions, as in the Ottoman Empire, or because they lacked political centralization, as in Somalia.
The persistence and strengthening of absolutism in Spain while it was uprooted in England is another example of small differences mattering during critical junctures. Spain was forged in 1492 through the merger of Castile and Aragon. The subsequent dynastic inheritances created a European superstate, and figures like Charles V continued the project of strengthening the absolutist state that Isabella and Ferdinand had begun. This effort was massively aided by the discovery of precious metals in the Americas, like the silver found in Guanajuato and Zacatecas in Mexico, and the royal fifth's share of wealth from conquest and mines.
After Spain's absolutist political system solidified, it went into relative and then absolute economic decline after 1600. The monarchy's actions included the expropriation of Jews in 1492 and the expulsion of the Moriscos between 1609 and 1614, forcing both groups to sell assets cheaply and forbidding them from taking gold or silver out of the country. Property rights were insecure for elites as well. Habsburg rulers repeatedly defaulted on their debts, such as Philip II doing so in 1557 and 1560, ruining the Fugger and Welser banking families, and subsequent defaults continued throughout the 17th century.
Unlike England, which allowed relatively broad-based participation in trading opportunities, Spain organized trade with its new colonies via a guild of merchants in Seville, which controlled all trade and ensured the monarchy got its share. This monopolized trade meant that no broad class of merchants could emerge.
The Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon both had their Cortes, a parliament, which needed to be summoned to assent to new taxes. However, the Castilian Cortes only represented 18 cities and never developed as a nexus of diverse interests to constrain absolutism, nor could it legislate.
When Charles V demanded increased taxation in 1520, opposition turned violent in the Comunero Rebellion, which he crushed with loyal troops. Though the battle for taxing rights ebbed and flowed, the monarchy ultimately won, and the Cortes did not meet again after 1664 for almost 150 years.
As absolutism triumphed in Spain, the state became increasingly ineffective and difficult to raise taxes for, selling offices and indulging in tax farming, while the English state was creating a modern, efficient tax bureaucracy. The result was widespread economic decline. Spanish incomes fell, and by the end of the 17th century, the urban population had halved.
In absolutist countries that failed to adopt industrialization like Russia and Austria-Hungary, the rulers actively blocked attempts to introduce new technologies and infrastructure such as railroads. In the Habsburg Empire, Francis I, who ruled until 1835, was a consummate absolutist who aimed to preserve the political status quo. He explicitly stated he did not need savants but good, honest citizens, and would remove any teacher who came with new ideas.
The Habsburg state lacked pluralistic institutions and a national parliament. When citizens from the Tyrol petitioned Francis for a constitution, he responded by warning them, "The soldiers obey me, and I will not ask you twice if I need money."
Francis I created a police state, ruthlessly censoring radical material. His rule was characterized by the unabated maintenance of the sovereign's authority and a denial of all claims on the part of the people to a participation in that authority.
At the center of Habsburg economic institutions stood serfdom, which highly circumscribed labor mobility. One of Metternich's assistants, Frederick von Jens, explicitly replied to proposed social reforms, "We do not desire at all that the great masses shall become well-off and independent. How could we otherwise rule over them?"
Crucially, Francis I did not merely neglect technology. He actively opposed and blocked the dissemination of technologies. He feared that industry would create factories, concentrating poor workers in Vienna who might become supporters for opponents of absolutism.
He implemented this fear directly, banning the creation of new factories in Vienna in 1802 and banning the importation and adoption of new machinery until 1811. Francis also opposed the construction of railways, one of the key new technologies of the Industrial Revolution. When a plan for a northern railway was presented, he replied, No, I will have nothing to do with it, lest the revolution might come into the country." Since the government wouldn't grant a concession for a steam railway, the first line built in the empire had to use horse-drawn carriages and was intentionally designed with gradients that made subsequent conversion to steam impossible. The ultimate goal was ensuring the stability of the extractive institutions and protecting the advantages of the traditional elites who supported him.
Farther east, Russia under Tsar Nicholas I had equally absolutist institutions founded on serfdom, where serfs were tied to the land, lacked freedom of occupation, and could be sold at will by their lords. Count Igor Kankrin, the finance minister between 1823 and 1844, aimed to strengthen the traditional political pillars, particularly the landed aristocracy, by keeping society agrarian. He reversed proposals to develop a bank for industry and instead lent to large landowners, using serfs as collateral, thereby choking off funds for industrial development.
Nicholas I feared the social changes from a modern economy. He worried that the growing mass of factory workers would gradually be corrupted and eventually turn into a class as miserable as they are dangerous for their masters. This fear led to banning industrial exhibitions, and following revolutionary outbursts in Europe in 1848, a law was enacted in Moscow in 1849 severely limiting the number of new factories, explicitly banning cotton or woolen spinning mills.
And just like in Austria-Hungary, opposition to railways accompanying opposition to industry. Kankrin opposed them, arguing they encouraged unnecessary travel from place to place, which is entirely typical of our time, viewing them as a socially dangerous mobility.
Absolutism reigned in Asia too, preventing industrialization. Under the Sung dynasty, 960 to 1279, China led the world in many technological innovations, and in 1500, standards of living were probably at least as high as in Europe.
However, China was absolutist, with no political representation, and the grip of the state tightened under the Ming and Qing dynasties. The absolutist emperors opposed change and feared creative destruction.
This is best illustrated by the state's monopoly on overseas trade. Emperor Hongwu of the Ming dynasty banned private individuals from trading with foreigners and did not allow Chinese people to sail overseas, only permitting international trade if it involved tribute giving, not commercial activity.
Though Emperor Yongle later sponsored Admiral Zheng He's huge government missions to Southeast Asia, Arabia, and Africa, after 1433, all overseas trade was banned by Hongji's successor, Xiande. By 1436, constructing seagoing ships was made illegal.
The inward turn continued under the Qing dynasty. In 1661, Emperor Kangxi ordered all people along the southern coast of China to move 17 miles inland, and a shipping ban was enforced until 1693.
Few merchants were willing to invest in trade when the emperor could suddenly change his mind and ban trade, making investments in ships and equipment worthless.
The reasoning behind opposing international trade was familiar: the fear of creative destruction. The ruler's primary aim was political stability, as international trade enriched and emboldened merchants, potentially destabilizing the regime.
As a consequence of this absolutist control, the Chinese economy was stagnant throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, while other economies industrialized.
Absolutism in Africa is shown by the Kingdom of Congo, and more durably by Ethiopia or Abyssinia. By the 14th century, the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia became the focus of the myth of King Prester John.
Accounts from travelers and diplomats such as Francisco Alvarez, 1520 to 1527, and Manuel de Almeida, from 1624, leave no doubt that Ethiopia was a perfect specimen of absolutism, with no pluralistic institutions or constraints on the emperor's power.
This absolutism led to great insecurity of property rights. The traveler John Bruce noted that all the land is the king's. He gives it to whom he pleases during pleasure and resumes it when it is his will. Even after the death of the owner, possessions reverted to the king.
Almeida's account is consistent, observing that it was usual for the emperor to exchange, alter, and take away lands every 2 or 3 years, or even multiple times a year. This meant no one cared for the land or planted a tree, because he knows that he who plants it very rarely gathers the fruit.
These descriptions suggest that absolutism was more intense in Ethiopia and economic institutions even more extractive than in European examples.
The last emperor, Haile Selassie, was overthrown in 1974. The basic extractive economic institutions of the absolutist Ethiopian empire, such as feudalism, lasted until they were abolished after the 1974 revolution.
Ethiopia failed to take advantage of industrialization opportunities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, underpinning the abject poverty of its citizens today. The income of an average Ethiopian is about a 40th of that of an average citizen of England, and only 1/3 of adults are literate.
absolutism was a barrier, but at the dawn of the 19th century, many parts of the world lacked a state that could provide even the minimal degree of law and order, which is a prerequisite for a modern economy.
Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, illustrates the devastating effects of the lack of political centralization. Historically, the population was organized into 6 clan families, most tracing their ancestry back to Somali.
Somali clans and Diapane groups, closely related kinspeople who pay blood wealth compensation, were historically locked into almost continual conflict over scarce resources like water and grazing land. Political power was widely dispersed. Clan leaders had no real power, and every Somali adult man was able to have his say on decisions through an informal council.
The constant state of warfare is reflected in their informal laws, called Heer, which heavily focused on blood wealth and feuding. A crime against one person was a crime against the whole Diapang group, necessitating collective compensation or collective retribution.
The lack of political centralization meant nobody respected another's authority, and no one, including the British colonial state, was able to impose order. It would have been unimaginable to invest in or adopt new technologies from Britain in such a climate.
We see subtle factors related to political stability inhibiting basic technologies elsewhere, too. In the Kingdom of Tikali in southern Sudan, writing was not used by the state or citizens, even though they had access to Arabic script.
The citizens feared the state would use writing to control resources, such as valuable land, or impose systematic taxation. Moreover, governing elites opposed writing because oral interaction allowed them maximum discretion, as written laws were harder to reverse or deny.
In Somalia, creating political centralization would have meant some clans being subject to the control of others, which they rejected. Any group attempting to centralize power would have faced stiff resistance.
As a consequence of this lack of centralization and basic security of property rights, Somali society never generated incentives to invest. And while industrialization was underway elsewhere, Somalis were feuding, and their economic backwardness became ingrained.
The Industrial Revolution was a transformative critical juncture. Societies under the grip of extractive political and economic institutions like Spain and Ethiopia failed to incentivize necessary investments.
Other absolutist regimes, including Austria-Hungary, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and China, went further, taking explicit steps to block the spread of industry and new technologies due to the fear of creative destruction.
But as we've discussed, absolutism is not the only barrier. Inclusive political institutions necessitate some degree of political centralization so the state can enforce law and order and uphold property rights.
Many nations today, such as Afghanistan, Haiti, Nepal, and Somalia, still have states unable to maintain rudimentary order, which destroys economic incentives.
In both cases, absolutism and lack of centralization, resistance to change is motivated by the fear that change will reallocate political power from those who currently dominate. This meant societies lacking centralization in the 18th and 19th centuries were particularly disadvantaged in the age of industry.
While extractive institutions failed to take advantage of the critical juncture, societies that already moved toward inclusive political and economic institutions, like the United States and Australia, or those where absolutism was seriously challenged, such as France and Japan, saw rapid economic growth.
Ultimately, the interaction between a critical juncture and existing institutional differences led to further institutional and economic divergence, which had fundamental effects on the prosperity and poverty of nations in the 19th century and beyond.